Okay. So while they're figuring out the slide situation, I'm going to start out with a question for everybody. What is a product? Can anyone answer that question? I'm going to pick on somebody if I don't have a volunteer. You guys can hear me, right? Okay, we have a volunteer.
No, just a product. Maybe it's a software first that provides services for users who have some needs. I don't know.
Okay, so the answer is it's a software. So that laptop computer in your lap, is that a product?
On n'est pas en réplication là.
The shirt you're wearing, is it a product? Okay. So it is a different kind, but I'm actually going to be talking about products. So obviously software products, because we're here at an open source conference. But there are things that all products have in common, whether it's a software product or a physical product or some other, even like an information product like a book. There are some things that all products have in common. And actually, that's part of what I'm going to be talking about. Like, what is the difference between just pure software, particularly just pure source code, and a product? So I might have to just freestyle this.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is okay. So the definition of a product is actually something that is manufactured or refined for sale. So that gives us a couple of hints. First of all, refined, so that indicates that it's something that humans have created, but also have constructed, have made beautiful in some way. But it also is something that's for sale. So a product is something that we buy. And the example that I'd like us all to think about is actually timber. Like if you go into a forest, you'll see a bunch of trees. You can have lumber. So lumber is boards that we use to build stuff. And then there's a chair. So both lumber and a chair are actually products, right? Whereas a piece of land with a bunch of trees on it, that is not a product. It's not refined in any way. Lumber and a chair are products, but they have a very different market, and people buy them for very different reasons. Most notably, people generally buy lumber because they want to build things like chairs, whereas people buy chairs because they want something to sit in. The reason I make this analogy in talking about the difference between code and products is actually that there's a lot of similarities. So when we think about what source code is and what an open source project is, so source code is a component of a product. It can be a very important component of that product, or it can just be a small piece of the product. But the point is somebody who, oh, and by the way, source code could, of course, be something that you pay for. There are certainly situations where that would be the case. But somebody who wants to just buy a piece of source code is like somebody who wants to buy lumber. They're not, the source code is almost never the finished product. It's going to be a component in somebody else's product, just like lumber is never going to be your finished product. It exists so that somebody can build something else with it. And now we can see my beautiful illustrations, which is amazing. You get to see a beautiful photo of me, but Ludo already did a good job introducing me, talking about my podcast, which we just recorded an episode of together, and also Open Source Founders Summit, which is a conference for founders of open source companies to talk about things like this, the difference between source code that you download and products, software products that you download. Okay, so let's see, how do I advance? I already talked about this. There's my beautiful illustrations of lumber and chairs. So the question, of course, for everyone is source code a product? is open source. Are open source projects a product? Now, actually, some open source projects are full products in that you get a full product experience from them. You don't actually have to there are other ways to download it usually than just downloading the source code. There are open source projects where you can download a full package, you install it on your computer, you're off and running. I use a podcast editing software that's open source, and that is the experience. It's completely free. You can download the source code if you want, or you can download it all packaged up and ready to go. Exactly the same experience as a software product. But that is not necessarily what you get just because something is open source. If you have a bunch of source code files, before you can get a product even that works, you have to compile them, you have to package them, you have to ensure that they're going to work in your environment. And even just those things make it so it's not quite on the level of a product for most people, the way most people, most particularly business users, non-developers would expect a product to work. It is very much like the difference between lumber and chairs. If you want a chair and someone gives you a piece of wood, you are going to be disappointed. So products are also, this is really important, they're a full customer experience. They are a lot more than just the functionality in a software. Now, there is a difference between when we think about a product that's for a consumer audience and a product that's for a business audience. As consumers of software products, we generally have fairly low expectations. Notably, if I buy a software product for my own use as an individual, I don't need to worry about forcing 500 other people to start using that software. If, on the other hand, I have a team of 500 people and I buy a software product for them, getting them to actually use it is actually a non-negligible task. Making sure that they all understand it, making sure that they like it. That's something that can be part of your product experience, this sort of white glove onboarding. The other thing is making sure that your own environment is optimized for that software. This can also be a part of a product experience that if you just have open source code, this is your problem. But if you buy a product from me, I will come in, I will make sure that you are getting the full value out of my product by ensuring not just that my product works, but that everything else that's going to touch it in your environment is optimized to make it work. This is something people actually often overlook, but obviously there's going to be a lot of dependencies. And sometimes the knowing what to look for in someone's environment can be a really important thing. Also, support. A support SLA. That can be part of a product. Compliance concerns. Now, again, as a consumer, this is why it's important to keep in mind the difference between the needs of a consumer and the needs of a business user. Consumers, they're not going to get audited by to see if they meet data privacy requirements. On the other hand, if you are a business, you work in a regulated industry, you might need to have assurances from all of your software providers that they meet the relevant laws. And having those certificates in place so you can have that compliance paper trail, part of your product. That is part of what you can get as a customer. SLAs around security patches, a seamless upgrade experience. These are all things that are valuable to customers, and they are not part of your source code, and they are not part of your open source experience. I didn't mean to make a pun about the name of this conference. So if you contrast this with just source code, if you download a piece of source code, all of the work required to onboard the rest of your team, that's on you. It can often be people problems, but that's on you. It's not on your software vendor because you don't have one. It's just open source. If you need to optimize your infrastructure, which often involves, quite frankly, for users of open source software, knowing and expecting things like knowing the unknown, optimizing the unknown unknowns because they don't even know what to look for. Good luck. We got some docs, but good luck. You want to upgrade? Good luck. I hope it doesn't break. It's all basically good luck, right? We're not going to hold your hand through the whole process. A lot of big enterprises, they do want somebody to hold their hand, not because they suck at implementing these, but because they know that you, person who has made this software, understands it 100 times better than they possibly can, because anyway, they have 100 other things that they have to think about. You spend all day, every day, thinking about how your piece of software, your software product, can work in the best way possible. You know all the unknown unknowns, so you know where to look. The thing is, doing this, if just downloading the open source, the source code, almost always requires both more time and more skill. That's why I took the lumber example, because you can absolutely take a piece of lumber and build it into a chair. It's going to take you more time than just buying your chair, and it is also going to take you some skill. And the fact is, most people have neither the time nor the skill to do that. Okay, so I wanted to give 2 examples of open source companies that follow this model, which is thinking of their product as everything that is not source code. Because that's really what I want to, the focus of this talk is to think of your product as everything that is not source code. This is a company called MedPlum. They make a developer platform for electronic health records, which is extremely sexy. And they have 100% open source code. So all of their open source, or all of their source code is completely open source. If you want to go on GitHub, download it all, set it up yourself, run it yourself, and use it, they have no problem with that. You will get 100% of all the same functionalities. Their bet, and what they find in their market, is that the types of companies that they tend to work with, the types of companies that need to build developer platforms for building electronic health record systems, they are not going to mess around with that, because they need these non-code things like compliance paper trails, like security SLAs, like somebody to call when things go wrong. And so they actually, of all the open source companies that I talk to, in many ways lose far less sleep than anyone else about their open source project cannibalizing their commercial customers, because they know that it's not the source code that their customers care about, it's everything around their source code, all those other things that you need in order to make it work. Now, you might be thinking, Emily, this sounds like a services model. It's not really. So having a security patch SLA or offering compliance certifications, that's actually part of the product. It's not services. Services is, I'm going to pay you X amount of money, you're going to build something new for me. Or it could be, I'm going to have a problem, I'll call you, you'll bill me per hour until we fix my problem. This is not the same. This is, we have this package that includes an SLA, that includes compliance certifications. You buy the software product, and it comes with all these things, and all these things matter a lot. System Initiative is another company that does this. It is essentially the same idea, just different company in a very different business. You can download all of their source code, but if you want to be assured that you're getting the best possible experience, if you want to make sure that your environment is optimized for their software, you have to be a commercial customer. If you want compliance certifications, you have to be a commercial customer. The founder of System Initiative is one of the co-founders of Chef, And this was also the model that Chef ended up following, all the source code being open source, and then everything that goes around to create a seamless customer experience that is part of the product, and that's what you pay for. Very interesting that in the case of System Initiative, they actively encourage other people to make money from System Initiative. But their value proposition when going to customers is, we are the only ones that know this software inside and out because we created it. So if you want the knockoff version, you go with the other options. But if you want a real Nike, then you should buy from us. Okay, so I touched on this. The difference between user communities and customer communities is one of the things that I'm personally really fascinated with. There's a lot of different ways that this can manifest itself in an open source company. The interesting thing is that when you take a model where all of your source code is open source, but you have the non-feature things that are what customers buy. You have a situation where your ideal customer and your ideal user communities are essentially two circles that don't touch. If you think about the market for lumber versus the market for chairs, that's what it is, right? There might be some overlap, but it's pretty small. Like, you sell your lumber to carpenter shops, you sell chairs to individuals. And that's what it looks like in these situations. The key to making this model work is to be super clear about what those different communities look like, what your user community looks like, and what your customer community looks like. Because that's how you can know what your customers care about, so what you need to package along with your source code in order to make it valuable to your customers. Okay, so I'm getting towards the end. 5 minutes. The key to building a business around open source software is actually really simple. It's to deliver value above and beyond your open source project, your open source code that your customers are willing to pay for. It's managing that delta between whatever your product is and whatever your open source project is. But here's the key, the point that I want to get across in this talk, is that features are only one way to do that. So we talk a lot about open core models. I feel like it kind of takes all the air out of the room when we talk about open source businesses. But features are only one way to do that. You can differentiate between project and product with support, with security SLAs, downtime SLAs, compliance trails, access to better quality data. So sometimes you might have software that relies on data. And your software, when it is open source, uses an open data set. And then you can have your own proprietary data set that your software uses, and that can be part of the thing that you sell. In that case, again, you can have all of the source code being open source and still have a better product with a delta in value that is something that's important for your customers. White glove onboarding, seamless upgrades. These are all things that serious customers, serious companies, they care about. Do they all care about them equally? No, not necessarily. That's why you have to know who your customers are. Okay, so takeaway, you can build an open source company with 100% open source code. Features are not the only way to differentiate between project and product. And you must know who your market is, who your user community is, and who your customer community is, who your paying customers are, because that is how you know what you can put into your product that people will be willing to buy. And that's all. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much, Emily. We can take a few questions. Is there any question? Yes? Go ahead.
Thank you. In the MedPlum, that's okay. In the MedPlum example you provided, who are the open source user versus the
Okay,
commercial?
I actually had a really excellent question. I'm really glad that you answered or that you asked this. The question is in the MedPlum example, who are the open source users? And the answer, if you actually ask the company, is that they don't really care. So, in fact, the CEO said literally, "Look, nobody as a hobby project is going to develop electronic healthcare records developer platforms because people don't do that. It's not fun." But the reason that it's open source, actually, in that particular case, isn't about building a huge community of users. Rather, it's about having radical transparency. So their customers are able to not just look at the source code, but also verify that it works. In their particular industry, it's really common apparently for companies to do POCs of software, like it, buy it, and then have like unpleasant surprises after the POC. And so having the open source project is basically a way to facilitate that POC, like build trust with their customers. Whether or not there's a user community, I mean, it's kind of a bonus if there is.
Do we have another question? So I wanted to make a remark. So if there's another question, please raise your hand. What I find really interesting with your vision is that one of the struggles of starting open source companies is that you need a lot of adoption. And when you close features, you kind of reduce the adoption. And the fact that you can have also a lot of value outside of the features allows you to still focus a lot on the adoption and have a business model, because that's kind of a very big challenge. Is that you need to find a business model. You cannot sustain the software otherwise, and so it's very tempting to close feature. But the more you close, the more the adoption might be a problem, especially against very large competitors. This is something that we experienced.
And also just to say, like, this is obviously not the only model, but I like people to be aware that it exists.
Yeah. Other question? Yes.
So I am more on the side that is buying the open source, because I work for a big tech. One of the challenges that we have is that sometimes we want to support open source without necessarily having to buy the product, because the product doesn't deliver as much value in comparison to the open source version. So is that doesn't seem to be a business model that is mature enough either on the side of the buyers and the side of the sellers, because the big tech companies, it seems that they don't even have the processes to fund open source, because that's not really a commercial model. So people from marketing don't want to deal with it because they don't see it as sponsoring. People from procurement, they want to deal with it because it's not an item. So any comments on how do we evolve that part, that gap between open source and product, something in between to fund the open source?
So I'm gonna take a different part of your question and to answer actually. So I apologize. Hopefully I'll cover everything. But one of the things you said is that the value of the open source project is actually higher than the value of the product. And this is actually a thing that I wish more founders of open source companies would see. There are certain situations where people are going to be more happy with your open source project than with your product. And you have to recognize those situations so that you're clear on your market, right? I had that slide with the different markets. There's people who are going to be happy, if you have a Venn diagram type, there's people who are going to be better off just in the section that's using your project, and you have to recognize that. So the product has to be different, but not necessarily always better in every case, because it's just not. If you think that that's the case, then you're deluding yourself. In terms of how big companies can support open source companies or open source projects if they don't see the value in buying the product, That is a really hard question because it implies a little bit of a charity mindset that I actually would like to see the ecosystem move away from. And in my opinion, that would be a situation where it's a good fit for a non-feature based for this model, right? A non-feature based differentiation where you can go to procurement and say, this is our open source project that we use. We could use it completely for free, but we want to be a customer so that we can have influence over the roadmap, for example. Or so that we can have, back channel support options, so that we can get some compliance things that are important, some integrations that are important for us, so that even if you get technology-wise the open source project, you're able to say, hey, there's these other things that we're going to get. Then it's like, in that case, having a support SLA or having a security SLA, that is always going to be an added benefit. Whereas having a different feature set or being forced to use a cloud product, that's not always going to be a benefit.
So we have one last question, actually, from a great open source project leader and from Grist. Go ahead.
Hi. I really like the analogy of lumber and chairs. I think it's interesting. But one thing about kind of that slide about published lumber sell chairs is that it seems to work when the same company is doing both and kind of selling chairs subsidizes the production of lumber. But if you have a big market for chairs and lots of people need chairs, it makes sense for there to be quite a few companies that make chairs, but maybe don't need as many companies that make lumber. Maybe one is enough. Do you have any thoughts about how kind of many chair manufacturers can all publish the same lumber? And
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of the where I thought you might go with the analogy actually was IKEA, because I didn't make all the stops on my analogy, right? There's a difference between something that you just have to sort of package up yourself and then you can run it versus something that's going to be completely done for you versus something that's completely a raw product. And the question is, like, how can companies work in an ecosystem, basically, so that there's multiple companies that are supporting the same open source project. A good example of this happening is the ClickHouse ecosystem, where there's a number of companies that have products around ClickHouse and or they offer services around ClickHouse, but only one company is actually the ClickHouse company. And this is something that works in the open source ecosystem. How fair the ClickHouse creators find that, I don't know, but they've raised tons of money, so they seem to be doing okay. But it's certainly, that is in many ways the most sustainable for the project, is to have multiple companies that are depending on it. And the other thing is, the only way that it works is if all the chair manufacturers, so to speak, are sort of pitching in to make sure there's more lumber, which is where the analogy starts to fall apart, right? So in the case of the ClickHouse ecosystem, there's a lot of companies that were not the creators of ClickHouse, but they do contribute to the core ClickHouse project now. And they make all sorts of extensions and other projects that are related to ClickHouse. So it becomes more of an ecosystem. And I think that can certainly work. It is definitely not the case that the only open source companies, the only people making money on open source, are the ones who created the project originally.
So thank you very much, Émilie Omier. You can talk to Émilie, find her on LinkedIn, listen to her podcast, and so thank you for this great presentation. We'll continue in a couple of minutes, actually very quickly, with a roundtable around NGI financing. So it's going to be back in French. Une voix pour l'Europe avec les GAFAM, le financement européen NGI et son impact sur l'écosystème. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So you actually